Alright, let's see how we did. Coming in from Etsy, this is the additional MPC style Spaceman in this form from the vendor on Etsy, who's wanting to make gun on this one's make good on that one's gun, having not survived through the sands of time. I really wish he hadn't used a bubble mailer, because this is a fairly stiff plastic and it's a replacement for one that was already damaged. I mean, dude, don't leave like that up to chance. Use a box and charge more for shipping. Oh, and again, here's why. Bingo. Broken gun barrel. It's like I'll just link the guy to the video. Thanks. You know, what do I do now? Get a third? Although it does have more of the equipment on his sprue. And it does have all three prongs on the rangefinder device. This the one that he sent before only had the one. And I mean, you know, he tried. And I guess I don't even want to get back into it with him, but it broke because you used a bubble mailer. Plain and simple. And I wanted to let's talk about why it broke. We'll line them up here with the grays on the top, and I have become convinced that these grays are recasts. And let's thank Commodore Reed at the Triang SpaceX Golden Astronaut Toy website for his research into the MPC Spaceman form. There's very little resource on, I want to say, post-1960s Apollo NASA era space toys. I wouldn't call these necessarily Apollo era, but they're NASA era. 60s, Mercury, after Project, these were made after Project Mercury became a public hit. And there's very little resource on the figures themselves. And Paul did a good thing by making a comparison based on examples he had obtained. This is a harder, more brittle plastic. Here on the bottom in red, white, and blue are original castings by MPC from the 1960s. It's a much more flexible plastic. You'll notice the pistol there is intact. And the question is, who cast these in gray and when did they do it? I don't know. I know that they're being sold as vintage. And if they were made prior to 1999, I think, 20 years ago, they technically are vintage. But they're made of a different plastic. The MPC things are slightly flexible. I'm not going to risk it too much. But this is what I would call a softer Army Man plastic. This is a harder plastic, and it's most importantly is not one of the original MPC colors, although I could be wrong about that, and they may have cast them in gray as well. I'm just satisfied that the reason why they're so numerous in this gray and relatively new old stock with their equipment, or at most some of their equipment still on the sprue, is that they were made in the late 70s to mid 90s. I'd say maybe even around the same time as the Glencoe reissues of the classic Archer Spaceman forms were made. But I'm going to agree with Paul that they're not 1960s vintage, and unfortunately MPC never marked the bases. MPC or multiple Toymakers, same company, never marked the bases of these classic, they're 5.5-inch guys, and nobody marked the bases on these, and I've actually been wondering if maybe the mold was simplified to cut down on the amount of plastic, and that's why we're not seeing the secondary tools like this coil of rope and whatever those two devices are to go with his broken pistol tip, which I'm not even going to bother whining to the guy. I just, whatever. He sent it to me. He was trying to make good on a purchase, and I'd already reviewed him for the original purchase based on the enthusiasm for a seller going out of their way to take care of me, and that's it. I'll just try to figure out a way to reattach it. What a disappointment. And again, it speaks to not only the as a testimonial to this plastic being more brittle and less forgiving than the old stuff, but it also speaks more specifically to the need for sellers to get a clue. Don't send vintage antique through the mail in a bubble wrap. What do you, or a bubble mailer? You have to put them in a box or you are an. And guess what? Anticipate that I'll be editing that video for language, amongst other things. Someone pointed out that if you're talking about toys, you should avoid profanity, and that's a good point. And I just wanted to show how I store these things. Here's my box with my bigger guys. There's the Marx figures, 6-inch Apollos, and some Timmy, and a couple of other Marx larger figures. But everything gets wrapped in a bag, and there's bubble wrap layers between them to prevent that mishap. And the reason to put them in a bag isn't to keep them from getting scratched up. It's to keep the different kinds of plastic from touching each other. Sometimes when hard plastic touches a soft plastic, there'll be what's called plastic burn. So that's the real reason to bag them up. If you're storing them together, if they're on a shelf, it doesn't matter. But if they're in a box together with different figures, or figures that you suspect are made of different pieces, you should always bag them. And now I've got to think about how to try to read here the barrel on that gun. And, you know, being a professional, I like to say, being a professional means learning to contend with genuine disappointment. And that's definitely a disappointment. But, you know, the things that'll turn up again.
Now you have your pick on father.
You don't use bubble mailers to send vintage hard plastic space toys through the mail. You don't use bubble mailers to send vintage hard plastic space toys through the mail. You don't use bubble mailers to send vintage hard plastic space toys through the mail. You don't. You don't. You don't use bubble mailers to send vintage hard plastic space toys through the mail. You don't use bubble mailers to send vintage hard plastic space toys through the mail. You don't use bubble mailers to send vintage hard plastic space toys through the mail. You don't use bubble mailers to send vintage hard plastic space toys through the mail.